Today in the EU elections candidates clash over what's best for the European economy. Candidates across the political spectrum are meeting twice this week to confront their adversaries and share their vision for Europe. What did they have to say about the state of the EU economy, and what are the priorities for their next mandate? Hello and welcome. I'm Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU.
Welcome to the second Bruegel Financial Times debate ahead of the 2024 European elections.
This is a packed debate week. Today we have the Eurovision debate in the Parliament. 2 days ago we witnessed the Bruegel debate. I sat down with Thomas Moller Nielsen, Euractiv economy reporter, who attended the debate with us. Thomas, who were the candidates on stage then?
On Tuesday, there were 4 candidates. So Nicolas Schmidt, he is the Spitzenkandidat for the European Socialists. There was Sandro Gozzi, who is the Spitzenkandidat for the Liberal Renew Group. There was Anders Vistesen, who is the Spitzenkandidat for the Identity and Democracy far-right group. And then you had von der Leyen herself. And I think that the fact that there were fewer people on stage on Tuesday is also part of the reason why I think the debate was far less kind of energized.
In comparison to the Maastricht debate, different candidates seem to agree way more than disagree on several topics.
So Maastricht, you had 8 different candidates, and there were candidates from the Green Party and also from the left. So I think if you look at the Maastricht debate in particular, von der Leyen usually was attacked from her left, I would say, on the whole. So in particular, if you remember, Walter Bayer attacked her position on Gaza, said, why aren't you sanctioning Israel if you're sanctioning Russia? Not that I support, that view, but I'm just saying that this was the criticism that was leveled from the left. Bas Eickhout, the Green Spitzenkandidat, who wasn't there on Tuesday, he also said, "Are you going to collaborate with the hard right the hard right ECR party?" Eventually, she ended up saying, "Yes, I might actually, we might actually have to collaborate with them." Depends on who ends up in the ECR group. But I think that's also part of the reason why the debate was far less interesting. There was, I think, from her left flank, von der Leyen was, much more protected on Tuesday than she was in Maastricht. Having said that, Anders Vistesen, the Spitzenkandidat for the ID group, he was really, I think in Maastricht, far more aggressive towards von der Leyen than he was on Tuesday.
Read my lips. We need a stop for taxation. This era of mass regulation must come to an end.
Right. At the same time, von der Leyen did not confront her opponents. She seemed to have a few points that, she stuck to. What do you think this behavior reveals? What type of strategy is she following?
My interpretation of what's going on is I think she thinks that she's going to win re-election as the European Commission president, and I think she just wants to do this in a very incident-free way. The fact is she didn't need to really be particularly aggressive yesterday. She didn't need to confront anyone. The person who was most confrontational was Sandro Gozzi. So when it comes to the Capital Markets Union, basically, to take a brief step back, the Capital Markets Union is this idea of, it's been around for around 10 years, and it's this idea of basically liberalizing the single market for capital as a way of leveraging hundreds of billions of euros of private investment, of private funds, which could be used to finance critical green and digital investments. It's become a much larger topic of discussion since Russia's invasion, which has massively impacted Europe's economy. In any case, Sandro Gozzi, on Tuesday, he said, we, the Liberal group, we're heavily in favor of the Capital Markets Union. The EPP, which has been in charge for the last 5 years, they've done nothing to advance the Capital Markets Union. You're not doing anything. And von der Leyen basically ignored him. But that was really the only time, I think, where she was really directly confronted. And just going back to Gozzi very briefly, Gozzi, so he went after von der Leyen. He also went after Schmidt. He said, Schmidt, you socialists, you don't do anything for SMEs, so small and medium enterprises. And then he also went after Vistesen.
Do you think then that Sandro Gozzi is the winner of the Bruegel debate?
He was the most confrontational, and so in that sense had the greatest zingers, I guess, if you want to say that. But I think the greatest victor is absolutely von der Leyen, because she survived another debate. She basically breezed through it.
The first section of the discussion was dedicated to competitiveness. A key phrase there was capital for companies. How do the different candidates plan on increasing EU market competitiveness?
on the whole, Schmidt, Gozi, and von der Leyen are basically in agreement. So they think that the main way in which Europe is going to become more competitive is to further integrate the single market, and in particular, the single market for capital. So they think basically if you liberalize capital flows, you're going to leverage hundreds of billions of private funds, and then these funds, they're going to be used to fund critical green and digital investments.
The future of Europe is decided at the level of investment. Either we are capable of investing, private and public, obviously, or we are not. And if we are not, well, we will lose.
I think part of the reason why I didn't find the debate yesterday particularly exciting is that there are very standard criticisms of that kind of view.
What are you referring to?
China is set to grow, according to the IMF's latest projections, by 4.6% this year. America is set to grow by 2.7%. The Eurozone is set to grow by 0.8%. Why is this? Well, one obvious thing, and again, I'm not defending this view, but I'm just saying it's a plausible view, is if you look at China and if you look at the United States, there's massive state investment in the economy. If Europe's going to become more competitive, you guys, you're all focusing on integrating the single market. But what about state-led industrial policy? China and America are growing much faster than Europe. They're both doing this. Maybe correlation is causation, but that wasn't really addressed. That would be the left criticism.
The Greens have decided not to partake in political debates. However, the party has also been critical of this view. How so?
With regard to the Green criticism, the Greens would say, well, when it comes to European competitiveness, and in particular the need to combat climate change, Europe has introduced these new fiscal rules, which have been criticized not just by the Greens, I should say, but by independent analysts. Many independent analysts think that these new fiscal rules limit member states' ability to make the sorts of investments that are required to combat climate change. They set very strict limits on member states' ability to accrue debt. So the Greens' point is, they say, number one, these investments are going to, especially green investments, they're not immediately profitable. They have to be done by the public sector. And number two, these new fiscal rules won't allow the public sector to do this. That issue was not discussed yesterday at all. Part of the reason for that is that the Green candidate wasn't there. Finally, to move to the ECR, or the right-wing views that maybe weren't discussed yesterday, I should have mentioned there was no ECR candidate. They've refused to participate in these debates. But one criticism that has been made, in particular by Michael Hoogeveen, who, not to plug my own article, but I did an interview with him a couple of weeks ago, but he said if you compare the United States to Europe, part of the reason why Europe isn't particularly competitive is the fact that in America there's this culture of private investment. There's a kind of capitalist culture. There's a startup culture. There's a fintech, financial technology culture. It's not just a purely economic issue as well. There has to be kind of cultural change, and so there has to be a greater emphasis on, much greater emphasis on financial literacy. And I know that some of the candidates yesterday do believe in that, but that kind of broader criticism, which is to say, look, it's not a purely economic issue why Europe isn't particularly competitive. There's also a cultural issue. That also wasn't addressed.
The United States and China did come up during the debate, not when it came to competitiveness, but rather when it came to economic security. Gozi, Schmidt, and Vistisen expressed strong views regarding EU-China bilateral relationships. Von der Leyen pushed back. What did she say?
So just to run through the candidates' views, so Vistisen was pretty vehemently anti-Chinese. I mean, he said basically, we need to ban TikTok. We need to basically push back China's economic expansion into the West. Gozi also was quite, I would say, hawkish. I know that's a value judgment, but I think that's a helpful way of understanding his views. He said, look, China's got, their trade policies in particular are very aggressive.
It's clear that the world is changing. The time where we could produce our product in China, we could import our energy from Russia, and we could delegate our security to the US is over.
Schmidt said at one point, he suggested that it's plausible that Europe is right now in the middle of a trade war with China. Von der Leyen said it categorically, and this is interesting also because Schmidt is a commissioner. Von der Leyen, who is the president of the commission, said, no, we're not in a trade war, directly contradicted Schmidt.
What do you think that is?
Von der Leyen, to me, it seems fairly obvious. Look, she doesn't want to generate any adverse headlines. Are we in a trade war with China? No. Put a lid on it. Von der Leyen is described by several people, and I would probably count myself as one of these people, as again being compared to other European leaders, much more hawkish. On the pro-China to anti-China spectrum, she's probably more on the anti-China spectrum, compared, again, to other European leaders, in particular Emmanuel Macron. But on Tuesday, she came across as more dovish. So she said, no, we're not in a trade war. What we're doing is we are launching these investigations according to WTO, so World Trade Organization rules. If we find China has unfairly subsidized its industries, then we will take appropriate action. She said, we're not going to do what the United States has done, which is basically impose blanket tariffs on all sorts of different Chinese products. She said, no, it's going to be targeted, and we're going to basically follow the rules, really. It's going to be based on international law.
The debate touched as well on the EU budget, whether to expand it, and if yes, what to prioritize investment-wise. What do the different candidates suggest?
So with regard to the European budget, this moment quite nicely encapsulates the entire debate. So von der Leyen, in an interview on Tuesday, so the morning of the debate with the Financial Times, she said what Europe needs to do is it needs to condition subsidies, in particular agricultural subsidies and also these cohesion funds that we spoke about, on reforms in member states. So the idea is Europe shouldn't just hand out this money. I should also mention the agricultural funds also account for roughly a third of the European budget, like the cohesion funds. So it's a massive part of the European budget. What Europe needs to do is it needs to condition these funds on reforms in member states. Now, other parts of the EU budget, not the regular budget, which is worth 1.2 trillion, but for the next generation EU funds, which is worth around 800 billion, this is the EU's pandemic recovery fund, payments are linked to reform. So the idea is, member states have to do something. They have to reform their labor market or they have to reform their pension systems, and then they get paid, right? And there's been a big discussion among European leaders recently about whether or not all of the EU budget, in particular the regular budget, should also be conditioned in this way. So on the one hand, you have smaller member states and I think poorer member states. They say, no, this is Brussels bureaucracy asserting itself in a way which is unhelpful, or in a way certainly that they don't like. You're going to force us to, reform our labor market before you give us cohesion money. What's that about? That's not fair. On the other hand, more conservative groups and also more frugal member states like the Netherlands and Germany and also some Nordic countries, they say, look, debt levels in Europe are already too high. We need to make sure that when we spend European monies that it's been done, for the right reasons, and that member states are implementing reforms that kind of cohere with the broader goals of the European project. So those are the two main views, described quite crudely.
Especially von der Leyen mentioned that Hungary is the country using the largest percentage of state funds, right? That kind of seemed a reference to her earlier interview.
Gurzi also said we should condition payments on rule of law and or on member states' adherence to the rule of law. And obviously Hungary has been heavily criticized for not adhering to European legal standards in various areas. So von der Leyen makes this argument. Gurzi kind of agrees with her. There's no real pushback. Vistessen's criticism of cohesion policy is not, hey, don't link it to reforms. He doesn't criticize that. He didn't criticize that specific policy proposal. What he did was he said, look, cohesion policy doesn't work. I went to Greece. This is his argument. I went to Greece, to Thessaloniki, and I saw cohesion funds being wasted. And Gurzi said, well, if you go to Spain, if you go to Portugal, if you go to Poland, you'll see, if you just look at Poland's growth rate, you'll see that cohesion funds do work. And then Vistesen said, well, okay, maybe I'll go on a trip to Portugal and Spain, maybe I'll go. But that was kind of the, in terms of the dialectic of the debate, it didn't go particularly deep. Von der Leyen's defending something which is quite controversial. She really wasn't taken to task on it. The only criticism was coming from Vistesen, who was just offering this kind of very general criticism of cohesion policy, which again might be legitimate. I'm not saying it's not legitimate, but in terms of like concrete kind of policy discussions, there really wasn't that much.
So you would have wanted a debate with a bit more heat?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I should mention that today, or later today at the European Parliament, there is another debate that will take place. So all of the candidates that were there on Tuesday will take part except for Vistesen. So on Thursday, there will be 6 candidates. So Gurzi, von der Leyen, Schmidt, who were there on Tuesday. Then Terry Reinke, a German co-Spitzenkandidat for the Greens, he'll be there. So he'll be replacing Bas Eickhout, who was there in Maastricht. And Walter Bayer will be there, who was also in Maastricht. He's the Spitzenkandidat for the European left. So I think in Maastricht there will overall be a broader, or at least On her left flank, von der Leyen will be perhaps more vulnerable than she was on Tuesday. I should also mention that they'll be discussing a much wider range of topics. So they'll be talking about, the economy as well, but also defense and climate and migration and innovation. So it'll be much broader. I think it'll be much more similar to the Maastricht debate. Having said that, there will be no Vistisen, so there'll be no kind of a right-wing firebrand. So will sparks fly? I don't know.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.